and to Mormonism. I mean, these are two very, very, very fast-growing religions, have people prepared to sacrifice enormously for it, have ancestors who were absolutely determined of the truth of it at the time, and who made extraordinary conquests in its name. If you're going to grant this for one religion, it seems to me you have to be willing, not just willing, you may indeed be compelled to make this concession for all of them. And that, I think, would be not just an unsafe assumption, but for most of you here, a distinctly unwelcome one. Now, I didn't get the chance, because I out-talked myself, and I'm sorry for it, to get to the moral dimension. And I'm interested that the word objective morality is the one that Dr. Craig chooses. Usually arguments about morality are whether morality is, so to say, absolute, or whether it's relative. As to objectivity, I think it's a very good compromise word, by the way, and I'm very happy to accept it. But the problem with morality is this, in respect of religion. You can't prove that anyone behaves any better if they refer this problem upward to a supreme dictator of a celestial kind. There are two questions that I've asked in public, and I'll try them again, because I try them on every audience. They're very simple ones. First, you have to name for me, or challenges, let's say, rather than questions. You have to name for me an ethical action or an ethical statement, or moral action, moral statement made or undertaken by a believer that I couldn't undertake or say, I couldn't state or do. I haven't yet had an example pointed out of that to me. In other words, that a person of faith would have an advantage by being able to call upon divine sanction. Whereas if I ask you to think of a wicked act undertaken by someone in the name of God or because of their faith, you wouldn't have, or a wicked statement made, you wouldn't have that much difficulty, I think, in coming up with an example right away. The genital mutilation community, for example, is almost exclusively religious. The suicide bombing community is almost exclusively religious. There are injunctions for genocide in the Old Testament. There are injunctions and warrants for slavery and racism in the Old Testament too. There's simply no way of deriving morality and ethics from the supernatural. When we come to the question of the absolute, well, the most often cited one is the Golden Rule, the one that almost everyone feels they have in common. The injunction not to do to others as you wouldn't want them to do to you. This doesn't, in fact, come from the Sermon on the Mount or from Christianity, or it doesn't originate with it. It's certainly adumbrated by Rabbi Hillel, a Babylonian rabbi, and it's to be found in the Analects of Confucius too. But it has, since we're talking about objective, relative, and absolute, a crucial weakness in it, unfortunately. We'd like to be able to follow it, but it's only really as good as the person who's uttering it. In other words, if I say, I won't treat you as I don't want you to treat me, what am I to do when confronted with Charles Manson? I want him treated in a way that I wouldn't want to be treated myself. Anything else would surely be completely relativistic. So the argument isn't at all advanced by saying that I couldn't know any of this. I couldn't have any moral promptings. I couldn't decide for myself if I see a pregnant woman being kicked in the stomach, that because she's pregnant, that's obviously worse than if it was just a woman who wasn't pregnant being kicked in the stomach. This is part of my patrimony as a human being. It's part of the essential emotional solidarity that I need to have with my fellow creatures to make us realize that we are brothers and sisters, one with another. We are dependent upon each other. We have duties. We have expectations of one another. And that if we didn't have these and try and fulfill them, we couldn't have got as far as we have. We couldn't have evolved as a species. We couldn't have ever had a society. There's never been a society found where rape and murder and perjury are not condemned. And these moral discoveries long, or absolutes if you want to call them that, long predate the arrival of anything recognizable as monotheism. It's a bit like the argument of free will. People say, well, how do you have free will? Do you think you do have it? Well, it's a very, very difficult subject indeed. Some religions say you don't, in effect, have it. That all is determined by heaven. You're really only a plaything in a larger game. I take that to be some of the point of Calvinism. There are some schools of Islam also that say it is only as Allah wills. There's no will of yours really involved, as long as you're willing to make the prostration and the obedience. So the connection between religion and free will isn't as simple, as easy as some people like to think it is. But I would say, yes, I think we have free will. And when asked why I think so, I would have to take refuge in philosophical irony and say, because I don't think we have any choice but to have free will. But at least I know at this point that I'm being ironic, and that some of the irony is at my own expense, and it's a risk I have to be willing to run. But the Christian answer is, of course you have free will. The boss insists upon it. This somewhat degrades the freedom and redefines the idea of will. And it seems to me also that there's something degrading in the idea of saying that morality is derived in the same way, that it comes from on high, that we ourselves are not good enough, that we don't have the dignity, we don't have the self-respect, we don't have the character to know a right action or a right statement when we see it or when we want to perform it. It's this servile element in religion. It's not, strictly speaking, the subject of our debate this evening, I know, but I'm damned if I completely forego it. It's the idea that buried in the religious impulse is actually the wish to be unfree, is the wish for an immovable, unchangeable, celestial authority, a kind of heavenly North Korea that will take our decisions away from us and commit us only to worship and praise and thank a great leader and his son, the dear leader, forever and ever and ever. I'm so glad there's no evidence that this is true. Thank you.
I'm sorry to have to begin by disagreeing with His Grace. If you're going to be a serious grown-up person and appear to defend the Catholic Church in public in front of an educated and literate audience, you simply have to start by making a great number of heartfelt apologies and requests for contrition and forgiveness. Now, you might ask, you're fully entitled to ask, brothers and sisters, who am I to say that? Well, in the Jubilee Millennium Year of 2000, the Vatican spokesman, Bishop Piero Marini, said, explaining a whole sermon of apology given by His Holiness the Pope, given the number of sins we've committed in the course of 20 centuries, reference to them must necessarily be rather summary. Well, I think Bishop Marini had that just about right. I'll have to be summary, too. His Holiness on that occasion, it was March the 12th, 2000, if you wish to look it up, begged forgiveness for, among some other things, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the persecution of the Jewish people, injustice towards women, that's half the human race right there, and the forced conversion of indigenous peoples, especially in South America, the African slave trade, the admission that Galileo was right, and for silence during Hitler's final solution, or Shoah. And it doesn't end there. There are smaller but significant, equally significant, avowals of a very bad conscience. These have included regret for the rape and the torture of orphans and other children in church-run schools in almost every country on earth, from Ireland to Australia. These are very serious matters, and they're not to be laughed off by references to the occasional work of Catholic charities. But I draw your attention not just to the apologies, ladies and gentlemen, but to the evasive and euphemistic form that they take. Joseph Ratzinger, the current Pope, considered by some, by Catholics, to be the Vicar of Christ on earth, in his comment, one of the few he's made, on the institutionalization of rape and torture and maltreatment of children in Catholic institutions, he has said, it's a very severe crisis which involves us, he said, in the following: in the need for applying to these victims the most loving pastoral care. Well, I'm sorry, they've already had that. And to say that this is the responsibility laid upon you by the horrific admission that you've already had to make is not accepting responsibility in any adult sense. The same euphemism comes in the term some Christians allow themselves to be deceived in this way and to act against the gospel. Well, anti-Semitism was preached as an official doctrine of the church until 1964. Do you think that might have something to do with public opinion in Austria and Bavaria and Poland and Lithuania. There'll come a time when the Church will issue apologies and explanations and half-baked appeals for forgiveness for things it's still doing. I think that there will be an apology for what happened in Rwanda, the most Catholic country in Africa, where priests and nuns and bishops are on trial for inciting from their pulpits and on the church's radio stations and newspapers the massacre of their brothers and sisters. Staying in Africa, I think it will one day be admitted with shame that it might have been in error to say that AIDS is bad as a disease, very bad, but not quite as bad as condoms are bad, or not as immoral in the same way. I say it in the presence of His grace, and I say it to His face. The preachings of His church are responsible for the death and suffering and misery of millions of His brother and sister Africans, and He should apologize for it. He should show some shame. For condemning my friend Stephen Fry for his nature, for saying you couldn't be a member of our church, you're born in sin. He's not being condemned for what he does, he's being condemned for what he is. You're a child made in the image of God. Oh no, you're not. You're a faggot. And you can't join our church and you can't go to heaven. This is disgraceful. It's inhuman. It's obscene. And it comes from a clutch of hysterical, sinister virgins who've already betrayed their charge in the children of their own church. For shame! For shame! I don't wish any ill on any fellow primate or mammal of mine, so I don't at all look forward to the death of Joseph Ratzinger. I don't. Or any other pope, not really, except for one tiny reason which I ought to confess and share with you. When he dies, there's quite a long interval till the conclave can meet, and for that whole time, that whole interval, it's a delicious, lucid interlude, there isn't anyone on earth who claims to be infallible. Isn't that nice? All I want to propose in closing is this. That if the human species is to rise to the full height that's demanded by its dignity and by its intelligence, we must all of us move to a state of affairs where that condition is permanent. And I think we should get on with it. Okay, thank you for having me.
Now, there is, on the historicity point, there are only two reasons, I think, to suppose that there may have been the figure of some kind of deluded rabbi present at that time. The first is the fakery of the story. The fakery itself proves something. The prophecy says this man must be born in the house of David, of David's line in David's town. It means he must be born in Bethlehem. Jesus of Nazareth is well known to have been born in Nazareth. In order to get him to Bethlehem, a huge fabrication has to be undertaken. A census is proposed by Caesar Augustus. No such census ever took place. The people of the region were not required to go back to their hometown to be registered. That's never happened. Quirinius was not governor of Syria in that year, as the Gospels say. None of the story of the Nativity is true in any detail, and not one of the Gospels agrees with each other on this fabrication. But the fabrication itself suggests something. If they were simply going to make up the whole thing, and there'd never been any such person, then why not just have him born in Bethlehem right there, and leave out the Nazarene business? So the very falsity of it, the very fanatical attempt to make it come right, suggests that yes, there may have been a charismatic, deluded individual wandering around at that time. But which is most impressive to you? The fantastic fabrications, the unbelievably inane and inarticulate preachments, or the inconsistencies in the story? You could mention another thing about the resurrection. Most of the witnesses to this are women, illiterate, stupid, deluded, hysterical females. of the kind who in a Jewish court at that time would have had about as much chance of being listened to as they would in an Islamic court today. What religion that wants its fabrication to be believed is going to say, you've got to believe it, because we have some illiterate, hysterical girls who said they saw this? No, it's impressive to me. It's impressive to me that the evidence is so thin, and is so hysterical, and is so feeble, and is so obviously, strenuously cobbled together, because it suggests that something was going on. There was some character. And I don't want to, therefore, to profane those who think that no, there must have been something, and say, no, there was nothing. This is not a whole cloth fabrication, but it is a very human and very intelligible and very pitiable, I think, practice of fraud that may have worked on stupefied peasants in the Greater Jerusalem area, but should really have no power to influence anyone in this room, whereas the noble methods and words and systems by which Socrates reasoned will continue to illuminate our path for as long as we care about the only real gift we have, which is our independent intelligence.
Religion makes the following appeal to us, which is why I say it poisons everything, because it goes to the deep nature of our self-respect and our humanity and our integrity. It makes the following bid to us. It says, you are born sinful. You're born guilty. You're guilty of crimes that were committed before you were born. You are not able to evade them. Your sin is original. You're made from dust, or in the Quran, from a clot of blood. Your Creator is not in a very good mood with you, and there's no reason why he should be, given what piece of excrement you basically are. That's the masochistic element of it. But after this thoroughgoing abjection, thoroughgoing demand that you throw aside all your self-respect, you're told there is, however, some redeeming news. The universe is designed with you in mind. The cosmos cares what happens to you. And if you will continue to abject yourself like a serf in front of God, you may hope for the forgiveness of sins, for eternal life, and for a divine plan. In other words, the maximum appeal to the abject, the servile in you, and the maximum appeal to the self-centered and the egomaniac. Not a very wholesome way to begin a discussion about the main questions, such as why are we here, who are we, what are we here for, what is the just city, how would it look like, what is the meaning of life. It's begun by a horrible lecture from a dictator. And you're then further told that if you do not bow the knee to a celestial dictatorship, unalterable, unchangeable, unappealable to, if you don't believe in that, you would have no means of telling right from wrong. How would you know how to do the right thing or avoid the wrong if you were not being told by a celestial dictatorship? Once again, an absolutely central attack on any concept that we might have of our own integrity, dignity, and self-respect. How would Huck Finn know? Admittedly, he's a fictional character, but then, so most of the people I'm going to be discussing, from Moses onwards. How does Huck Finn know that he's not to betray his friend Jim? He's not to give him back. He's not to give him up to the people who are hunting for him. How does Mark Twain know that we will like Huck when he refuses this? What does Huck know? The law is against him. The church is against him. All the preachments of religion and customary law are against him. He thinks that if he refuses the demand to give up his slave friend, he's going to go straight to hell. That's what he thinks, but he still does the right thing. As we might all hope to do, as we must all hope to do, if we were tested much less than that. It's innate in us. Religion gets its morals from us. We know what the right thing is without being told by a celestial dictatorship. If it were otherwise, this is why I say I'm an anti-theist, not an atheist. If it were otherwise, what would the situation be?
every one of our waking and sleeping thoughts would be under permanent surveillance at all times from the moment of our conception, according to some at any rate, certainly birth, until not just when we died, because that's when the real fun would begin. Religion gets its morality from us. We know innately. You don't have to teach a child the golden rule. You sometimes have to reinforce it a bit, but you don't have to teach the principles of it. Same with the New Testament. How do we know this? Because the story of the Good Samaritan is told by the alleged Nazarene, in whose existence I also do not believe. But he talks of a person who went out of his way on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho to help a fellow creature in need. Very obviously, this man cannot have been a Christian, because it's the young Jesus talking about him. He knows the story already. He's able to tell people that's the way you should behave if you see people in trouble. He never says you need divine permission to do this or a divine warrant to do it. It's ordinary human ethics. And to say that it wouldn't be part of us, part of our warp and our weft and our woof, if it wasn't for divine permission, is to make ourselves into serfs. So I propose we repudiate that and, as it were, stand on our own 2 feet a bit more. Now, speaking of serfdom, well, Mr. Hitchens, isn't it the case that in the last century some of the worst atrocities, if not the worst of all, were perpetrated by atheists and secularists? Is this not the fact? Very serious question. I have a whole chapter about it in my book. Shall I read it all to you? No, I won't do that. It's available at fine bookstores everywhere. And will be available after this show, where I'll be very polite to anyone who has a receipt, but not to anyone else. Someone asked me the other day, "Are you a materialist?" I said, "Are you joking? Yeah. This is America." Well, take the cases that are before us, the most notorious ones. In the case of fascism, the movement that coined the term totalitarianism, that actually put it into circulation, religion being, in my view, implicitly totalitarian with its admiration of an absolute, unchallengeable ruler, there's no other way to describe the fascist movement beginning in Spain, Portugal, Italy, spreading through Croatia, Austria, large parts of Germany, Hungary, Slovakia, except to say it was a movement of the Roman Catholic Rite. That's what it was. It was a completely Christian movement. All of its leaders were believing Christians. It had an official concordat with the Vatican. The Nazi puppet state leader of Slovakia was actually a man in holy orders. General Franco was very nearly baptized in his rule by that. Anyone can look this up. The church has never ceased to apologize for it, and nor should it. And after the war was over, they helped many of these people escape and begin constructing regimes of a similar model in South America after 1945. No wonder they can't stop apologizing. Nothing secular about that. German National Socialism, not quite the same, I have to say. It's true that the Vatican signed a treaty with Hitler the week he was installed in power. And it was for him the first and most important treaty he ever signed, the concordat with the Vatican, and neither of them ever broke it. It's also true to say that in Mein Kampf he praises the Catholic Church and never left it, and has nothing but contempt for atheism. It's also true that the Pope ordered that his birthday, the Führer's birthday, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, be celebrated from the pulpit every year, every April, which it was, to the very end. It's also true that 25% of the members of the SS, this we know from Catholic historians, were confessing Catholics, ones who went to confession, and that no one was ever threatened with excommunication for their role in the Endlösung, as the Germans call the Shoah, or the final solution. Excommunication was only used by the church politically after the war, when you were told you'd be excommunicated if you voted for the Communist Party. And it is true that Joseph Goebbels was excommunicated from the Catholic Church. But do you want to know why? Do you know why? He's married a Protestant. Yeah. Married a Protestant. That's what it took to be. Next, you'll know he didn't eat fish on a Friday or something. No, excuse me, they have their standards, okay? But it is also true that Hitler sought to replace Christianity as the state religion and would have preferred an Aryan Nordic blood myth with himself as the centerpiece of it. There's no question about that. And that many brave Christians had to die on that proposition. No one can deny that. But there's nothing secular about National Socialism. And of the third partner in that revolting alliance, that of Japan, the leader is not just a man of God, but a God himself, for whom people were prepared to immolate themselves and others. The late Emperor Hirohito. Moving. Still answering my own, not my own question, the other person's question. Moving to Russia, until 1917, the year of the revolution, millions and millions of Russians have been told for hundreds and hundreds of years that the head of their state was also a man of God, was the head of the church, was not quite human, a bit better than human, not quite divine either. The Tsar was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. He was the little father. As well as owning everyone in the country as an absolute dictator, he was the spiritual leader of the church. That's how millions of Russians have been reduced to credulity, stupidity, servility, and fear. Thus the state of affairs. If you were Joseph Stalin, who studied for many years in a seminary to become a priest, and would have made a very good bishop if he'd stuck at it, if you do not realize what an opportunity you've just been given with this vast reservoir, then you shouldn't be in the dictatorship business. Immediately, an inquisition is set up. Heresy hunts begin. Trials of heretics are put on. Miracles are announced. Lysenko's biology will produce giant tomatoes and 4 harvests a year. Everything is to be expected from the leader. All praise is due to him. All thanks are required of you for him. It's not very difficult to see what the analogy is there, and I won't bore you with what happens in China, and I've already told you about North Korea. It's a simulacrum of, a borrowing of, and an inheritance from the willingness of people to take things on faith. Everybody in America believes that everybody else is a strong believer. Everybody believes the opinion polls that say everyone else goes to church and believes in Satan more than they believe in Darwin. Everyone else thinks you can't run for office unless you bow the knee. And this is not true, and your presence here partly materializes my belief that it isn't, as did my swing through the South, where thousands of people came to each stop and all looked around themselves thinking, God, I thought I was the only atheist in this town till I got here. We had to move out of the bookstore in North Carolina into a church to fill up the overspill.
I want to say, in other words, that religion is the outcome of unresolved contradictions in the material world. That if you make the assumption that it's man-made, then very few things are mysterious to you. If you make the assumption that religion is man-made, then you would know why, it would be obvious to you why, there are so many religions. When you make the assumption that it's man-made, you will understand why it is that religion has been such a disappointment to our species, that despite innumerable revivals, innumerable attempts again to preach the truth, innumerable attempts to convert the heathen, innumerable attempts to send missionaries all around the world, that the same problems remain with us, that nothing is resolved by this, that if all religions died out, or all were admitted to be false, instead of, as all believers will tell you, only some of them are false. In other words, we're faced with the preposterous proposition that religion are either all of them true, or none of them true, or only one exclusive preachment is true. And none of these seem to me coherent, and all of these seem to be the outcome of a man-made cult. Assume that all of them were discredited at the same time, all of our problems would be exactly what they are now. How do we live with one another? Where indeed do morals and ethics come from? What are our duties to one another? How shall we build the just city? How shall we practice love? How shall we deal with the baser, what Darwin called the lowly stamp of our original origins, which comes not from a pact with the devil or an original sin, but from our evolution as well. All these questions, ladies and gentlemen, would remain exactly the same. Emancipate yourself from the idea of a celestial dictatorship, and you've taken the first step to becoming free. Thank you. what I have discovered in voyaging around this country and others in this debate, and just debating with Hindus, with Muslims, with the Jews, with Christians of all stripes, is that the arguments are all essentially the same for belief in the supernatural, for belief in faith, for belief in God, but that there are very interesting and noteworthy discrepancies between them. And one that I want to call attention to at the beginning of this evening is between those like my friend Doug Wilson, with whom I've now done a book of argument about Christian apologetics, who would call himself a presuppositionalist, in other words, for whom really it's only necessary to discover the workings of God's will in the cosmos, and to assume that the truth of Christianity is already proven, and what are called, and they include Dr. Craig with great honor and respect in this, the evidentialists. Now, I want to begin by saying that this distinction strikes me first as a very charming distinction, and second as false, or perhaps as a distinction without a difference. Well, why do I say charming? Because I think it's rather sweet that people of faith also think they ought to have some evidence. And I think it's progress of a kind. After all, if we had been having this debate in the mid-19th century, Professor Craig or his equivalent would have known little or probably nothing about the laws of physics and biology. Maybe even less than I know now, which is to say quite a lot in its way. And they would have grounded themselves, or he would have grounded himself, on faith, on Scripture, on revelation, on the prospect of salvation, on the means of grace, and the hope of glory, and perhaps on Paley's natural theology. Paley, who had the same rooms, or had the same rooms later occupied by Charles Darwin in Cambridge, with its watchmaker theory of design that I know I don't have to expound to you, but which briefly suggests that if an Aborigine is walking along a beach and finds a gold watch ticking, he knows not what it's for, or where it came from, or who made it, but he knows it's not a rock, he knows it's not a vegetable, he knows it must have had a designer. The Paley analogy held for most Christians for many years, because they were willing to make the assumption that we were mechanisms, and that therefore there must be a watchmaker. But now that it's been, here's where the presuppositionalist versus evidentialist dichotomy begins to kick in. Now it's been rather painstakingly and elaborately demonstrated, to the satisfaction of most people, I don't want to just use arguments from authority, but it's not very much contested anymore, that we are not designed as creatures, but that we evolved by a rather laborious combination of random mutation and natural selection into the species that we are today. It is, of course, open to the faithful to say that all this was, now that they come to know it, now that it becomes available to everybody, now that they think about it, and now that they've stopped opposing it or trying to ban it, then they can say, actually, on second thought, the evolution was all part of the design. Well, as you will recognize, ladies and gentlemen, there are some arguments I can't be expected to refute or rebut, because there's no way around that argument. I mean, if everything, including evolution, which isn't a design, is nonetheless part of a divine design, then all the advantage goes to the person who's willing to believe that. That cannot be disproved. But it does seem to me a very poor, very weak argument, because the test of a good argument is that it is falsifiable, not that it's unfalsifiable. So this I would therefore, this tactic or this style of argument, which we've had some evidence of this evening, I would rebaptize, or might I dare say I would rechristen it, as retrospective evidentialism. In other words, everything can, in due time, if you have enough faith, be made to fit. And you too are all quite free to believe that a sentient creator deliberately, consciously put himself, a being, put himself or herself or itself to the trouble of going through huge epochs of birth and death of species over eons of time, in which 99%, in the course of which, at least 99.9% of all species, all life forms ever to have appeared on Earth have become extinct, as we nearly did as a species ourselves. I invite you to look up the very alarming and beautiful and brilliant account by the National Geographic's coordinator of the Genome Project. By the way, you should send in your little sample from the inside of your cheek and have your African ancestry traced. It's absolutely fascinating to follow the mitochondrial DNA that we all have in common and that we have in common with other species, other primates, and other life forms, and find out where in Africa you came from. But there came a time, probably about 180,000 years ago, when, due to a terrible climatic event, probably in Indonesia, an appalling global warming crisis occurred. And the estimate is that the number of humans in Africa went down to between 40 and 30,000. This close, think about fine-tuning, this close to joining every other species that had gone extinct. And that's our Exodus story, is that somehow, we don't know how, because it's not written in any scripture, it's not told in any book, it's not part of any superstitious narrative, but somehow the escape from Africa to cooler latitudes was made. But that's how close it was. You have to be able to imagine that all this mass extinction and death and randomness is the will of a being. You are absolutely free to believe that if you wish. And all of this should happen so that one very imperfect race of evolved primates should have the opportunity to become Christians or to turn up at this gym tonight. But all of that was done with us in view. It's a curious kind of solipsism. It's a curious kind of self-centeredness. I was always brought up to believe that Christians were modest and humble and comported themselves with due humility. And there's a certain arrogance to this assumption that all of this extraordinary development was all about us. And we were the intended and desired result, and everything else was in the discard. The tremendous wastefulness of it, the tremendous cruelty of it, the tremendous caprice of it, the tremendous tinkering and incompetence of it, never mind. At least we're here, and we can be people of faith. It doesn't work for me, I have to simply say that, and I think there may be questions of psychology involved in this as well. Believe it if you can. I can't stop you. Believe it if you like. You're welcome. It's obviously impossible, as I said before, to disprove, and it equally obviously helps you to believe it if, as we all are, you're in the happy position of knowing the outcome. In other words, we are here, but there's a fallacy lurking in there somewhere too. Is there not? Now, it's often said, it was said tonight, and Dr. Craig said it in print, that atheists think they can prove the non-existence of God. This, in fact, very slightly but crucially misrepresents what we've always said. And there's nothing new about the new atheists, it's just we're recent. There's nothing particularly new. Dr. Victor Stenger, a great scientist, has written a book called The Failed Hypothesis, which he says he thinks that science can now license the claim that there definitely is no God, but he's unique in that, and I think very bold and courageous. Here's what we argue. We argue quite simply that there's no plausible or convincing reason, certainly no evidential one, to believe that there is such an entity, and that all observable phenomena, including the cosmological one to which I'm coming, are explicable without the hypothesis. You don't need the assumption. And this objection itself, our school falls into at least two, perhaps three sections. There's no such thing, no such word, though there should be, as adeism, or as being an adeist, but if there was one, I would say that's what I was. I don't believe that we are here as the result of a design, or that by making the appropriate propitiations and adopting the appropriate postures and following the appropriate rituals, we can overcome death. I don't believe that, and for a priori reasons, don't. If there was such a force, which I cannot prove by definition that there was not, if there was an entity that was responsible for the beginning of the cosmos, and that also happened to be busily engineering the very laborious production of life on our little planet, it still wouldn't prove that this entity cared about us, answered prayers, cared what church we went to, or whether we went to one at all, cared who we had sex with, or in what position, or by what means, cared what we ate, or on what day, cared whether we lived or died. There's no reason at all why this entity isn't completely indifferent to us. You cannot get from deism to theism except by a series of extraordinarily generous to yourself assumptions. The deist has all his work still ahead of him to show that it leads to revelation, to redemption, to salvation, or to suspensions of the natural order, in which hitherto you've been putting all your faith, all your evidence is on scientific and natural evidence, or Why not, for a change of pace and a change of taste, say yes, but sometimes this same natural order, which is so miraculous in observation, no question about it, is so impressive in its favouring the conditions for life in some ways, but it's randomly suspended when miracles are required. So with the caprice and contempt, these laws turn out not to be so important after all, as long as the truth of religion can be proved by their being rendered inoperative. This is having it both ways in the most promiscuous and exorbitant manner in my submission. Bear in mind also that these are not precisely the differences between Dr. Craig and myself, I mean, morally or intellectually equivalent claims. After all, Dr. Craig, to win this argument, has to believe and prove to a certainty. He's not just saying there might be a God, because he has to say there must be one, otherwise we couldn't be here and there couldn't be morality. It's not a contingency for him. I have to say that I appear as a skeptic who believes that doubt is the great engine, the great fuel of all inquiry, all discovery, and all innovation, and that I doubt these things. The disadvantage, it seems to me, in the argument goes to the person who says, no, I know it must be true, it is true. We're too early in the study of physics or biology, it seems to me, to be dealing in certainties of that kind, especially when the stakes are so high. It seems to me, to put it in a condensed form, extraordinary claims, such as the existence of a divine power with a son who cares enough to come and redeem us, extraordinary claims require truly extraordinary evidence. I don't think any of the evidence we heard from Dr. Craig, brilliantly marshalled as it was extraordinary enough to justify the extreme claims that are being made and backed by it.
But when Socrates was sentenced to death for his philosophical investigations and for blasphemy, for challenging the gods of the city, and he accepted his death, he did say, well, if we are lucky, perhaps I'll be able to hold conversation with other great thinkers and philosophers and doubters too. In other words, that the discussion about what is good, what is beautiful, what is noble, what is pure and what is true could always go on. Why is that important? Why would I like to do that? Because that's the only conversation worth having. And whether it goes on or not after I die, I don't know. But I do know that it's the conversation I want to have while I'm still alive. Which means that to me, the offer of certainty, the offer of complete security, the offer of an impermeable faith that can't give way, is an offer of something not worth having. I want to live my life taking the risk all the time that I don't know anything like enough yet, that I haven't understood enough, that I can't know enough, that I'm always hungrily operating on the margins of a potentially great harvest of future knowledge and wisdom. I wouldn't have it any other way. And I'd urge you to look at those of you who tell you, those people who tell you at your age that you're dead till you believe as they do. What a terrible thing to be telling to children. And that you can only live, and that you can only live by accepting an absolute authority. Don't think of that as a gift. Think of it as a poisoned chalice. Push it aside, however tempting it is. Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way. Thank you.
Last week I travelled to Washington to interview author, journalist and public intellectual Christopher Hitchens. The interview's in two parts. We'll screen it over the next 2 nights. Hitchens was diagnosed with cancer earlier this year while on tour promoting his memoir, Hitch 22. Tonight's interview deals with how he responded to the illness and whether facing death has softened his fierce atheism or caused him to modify his belief that religion poisons everything. Here's the first of our 2-part special.
It's very good to see you. Tony, nice for you to come to PC.
It's a pleasure to be here, and although the circumstances aren't great, and the question that most people are going to want to know is, how are you at the moment? How are you feeling?
If this had been yesterday, I was wondering, in fact, yesterday, if I could do this today. That's because I've just had a kill or cure dose of venom cocktail mainlined into me, and in the first few days after that, you feel very compromised, very nauseated, very weak, very demoralized. And that's on top of knowing why you have to have it, which is I have a tumor in my esophagus, which is spread. So it's called stage 4. The thing about stage 4 is there is no stage 5. So I'm finding out how this can be managed, whether I can live with it, whether it can be, I doubt curable. I think the word curable doesn't really apply, but it can be treatable. What kind of life and how much of it I have is my big preoccupation now.
Are the treatments working? Do you know?
Well, the tumors were shrinking with the first round, but they've stopped doing that. They're having to try something a bit stronger now, and I may be a candidate for radiation therapy, which is a very tough thing. You've got to be quite strong for it. I have quite a decent constitution in spite of all my abuse of it and my advanced years. I'm still quite robust. But the
we wouldn't say advanced years.
Chemo, well, I'm in my 60s now. I finally look it. I think people until I was 60 would always say they thought I looked younger, which I think, without flattering myself, I did, but I think I certainly have, as George Orwell says people do after a certain age, the face they deserve.
So are you actually up for a long interview about life, death, the universe and everything?
Oh, yes. I mean, my interest in all the large questions hasn't dimmed at all. In fact, it's quite a good way of concentrating the mind.
You've talked and you've written about the cancer right from the beginning, and people have been following your account as you put out your monthly pieces in Vanity Fair, and you've talked about crossing a border into the land of malady. What is that like?
Well, for me personally, it was a bit like being deported, in that I woke up in New York, having gone to bed feeling more or less okay, during a very grueling book tour, and I woke in the morning thinking I was actually dying. The whole liquid sac, the pericardium as it's called, around my heart had just filled up. It was as if my whole chest cavity had been crammed with wet cement. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. And I managed to call the emergency services, and these wonderful New Yorkers arrived, but sort of very heavily armed, and with sort of cuffs and torches and boots. And I remember thinking idly as they loaded me into the ambulance, why do they need all this for one stricken civilian? It was a bit like being arrested and deported, and in fact, in their kindly way, they were escorting me across the frontier from the land of the well into the land of the very ill indeed. And well, it's not a transition you can ever forget making, and of course, it's not one you can ever fully make back again either. I mean, however well I respond to treatment, I'll never be able to feel the way I did the day before.
What does it actually mean for your day-to-day life? Because we see you continually out there writing, doing interviews like this, taking on, as you said, lectures, debates. I mean, how hard is it to actually get yourself out of bed in the morning to continue the life of a public intellectual?
Well, I don't get out of bed much before 11 these days, and I go to bed much earlier than I did. So I can do about half, I suppose, of what I was doing before. I can continue to write as well. That's my big test. There were a couple of days when I was afraid I wasn't going to be able to write, and that terrified me very much, because being a writer is what I am rather than what I do. It's my, without sounding, I hope, too affected, it is my raison d'etre, and as well as being terrified of the thought that I wouldn't be able to do what I'm supposed to do, I was afraid that it would diminish my will to live. I mean, what would I be doing if I couldn't write? But that, fortunately, hasn't proved to be the case, and I can read any day, and I still read a lot, and I can write any day, but much more slowly and fewer words.
Being a writer, you actually personified or personalised the cancer. You call it a blind, emotionless being. That is a pathetic fallacy. You've acknowledged that yourself, but does it feel like that you've been invaded by something?
Well, obviously it can't have emotions, and as far as we know it can't see. It is a being. The thing is, it can't have a life of its own, but it is an alien, and it is alive as long as I am. Its only purpose is to kill me. It's a self-destructive alien. It's like the absolute negation, I suppose, of being pregnant. Having something living inside you that is entirely malevolent and that doesn't wish for, is purposed to encompass your death. And keeping company with this is a great preoccupation. Once you think about it like that, it's hard to unthink it.
How do you feel about the people who are praying for you? Because there are some who are praying for you to go to hell. There are some, many more, in fact, who are praying for you to be cured, and some who are praying for you to be converted.
That's right, or converted and cured, to be fair to them. Well, to the people who pray for me to not only have an agonizing death, but then be reborn, to have an agonizing and horrible eternal life of torture, I say, well, good on you. See you there, sort of thing. I don't feel I'm very much obliged to engage with them. For the people who ostensibly wish me well or are worried about my immortal soul, I say I take it kindly. I mean, it's a show of concern. It's a show of solidarity, which is a very important word to me. It's a kindness. If it doesn't do any good, and I'm sure it doesn't really do any harm. The only objection I have is one I touched on a moment ago, which is it seems to me a bit crass to be trying to talk to people about conversion when you know they're ill. The whole idea of hovering over a sick person who's worried and perhaps in discomfort and saying now's the time to reconsider strikes me as opportunist at the very best, and has a very bad history in the past. There have been false claims made by people who bothered Thomas Paine while he was dying, or and could publish false reports later that he'd recanted on his deathbed. We even tried that on Charles Darwin. There was an attempt at a false story of that kind. This, I think, is shameful, and to the extent that it reminds me of that, I resent it.
The New York Times says your illness has actually spurred one of the most heated discussions that they can remember of belief, religion, and immortality. It's almost inevitable, isn't it, when a famous atheist faces death, that this will happen?
Yes. Yes, it's an occasion, and people never tire of saying as they do. Many people write to me or email me, including perfect strangers, readers, well-wishers, sometimes former students or people who know me a little bit. They all, one way or another, make the point that, okay, I won't pray for you, don't worry, or perhaps you don't mind if I do. They all do it as if they're doing it for the first time. It's rather touching. But as I say, the arguments about immortality, the supernatural, the last things, death, judgment, heaven and hell, are or are not valid, quite independently of my mental or physical state. And so there's something fishy to me in the suggestion that, okay, now that your system is breaking down, wouldn't it be a good moment for you to repudiate the convictions of a lifetime? Again, there's something about the underlying assumption there that I want to resist.
More than 20 years ago, you mentioned Thomas Paine, but more than 20 years ago, the Oxford philosopher A.J. Ayer wrote about being drawn to a red light when he'd had a near-death experience, and that was interpreted by a lot of people as a suggestion that it actually changed his views of a lifetime. Are you worried this kind of thing could happen to you?
There are two great, Freddie Ayer's dead now. He died not long after that. But there have been in the recent past two great humanists and atheist thinkers, himself and Professor Daniel Dennett, who've come very, very close to death and in a semi-conscious state, enough to allow them to speculate about consciousness independent of the brain and other things that fascinate all of us. But both of their conclusive essays on this matter are in my collection, The Portable Atheist, because they both, having undergone so to say, that test, came out with their convictions unaltered.
Not entirely unaltered in Ayres' case. I mean, he did conclude the experience weakened his conviction that death would be the end of him. So he had not a conversion, but at least a doubt thrown in about his pure atheism.
Well, we can't say any more than we can say there is no God, that there is no afterlife. We can only say there is no persuasive evidence for or argument for it. But I think I'd be much more willing to say there's no evidence at all that any human being can tell you how you qualify or what's meant by seeing some bright light at the end of the tunnel or coming towards you, or that if you only make the right propitiation or right incantation or join the right church, they can tell you about how things will be after you're dead. I'm quite sure there's no human agency that can do that. I like surprises. If there's to be a second look around with somehow not me and not my brain, but some kind of consciousness, well, that would be more fascinating than many days I've spent in real life.
It would indeed. These debates have been going on for centuries, though, and
yes, I think will persist.
You quote Blaise Pascal, who talked about a wager that could be made, where with a God that would actually allow you at the very last minute to make a deal with him, to believe for a brief period. And that wager would be, what have you got to lose?
Well, it's rightly called a wager because there's something rather hucksterish about it. And I'm not a Christian, let alone a Roman Catholic Christian, as Pascal was. And I'm also not a theorist of probability, as he was. He was a great mathematician. But I say hucksterish for this reason. His wager assumes two things. One, a very cynical and credulous God. In other words, a God who would say, well, I can see your mind working, and I know that you're wagering on me because what have you got to lose? So naturally I'll reward you if you say you believe in me. I mean, why does that follow? Why wouldn't you think that's not a very good reason? It's not very good reasoning. It's not a very good motive. You might just as well be a God. In fact, you should prefer to be a God who would say, actually, I've more respect for the person who couldn't bring himself to believe and certainly wouldn't claim to do so in the hope of getting a favor.
Yes, we're talking now logic, and of course a jealous
Well, not just
God.
logic. I think there's a moral tinge to this.
Well, exactly, because there's an argument that the jealous God who would consign non-believers to hell is actually immoral, so why would you follow him anyway?
There's actually a Sufi prayer from the Middle Ages that is addressed to the Creator and says, Master, or however these things are addressed in, if I pray to you in the hope of getting heaven for myself, you should deny it to me. And if I pray for you only in the fear of hell, you should send me there. These would be bogus forms of belief. They'd be simply behaviorist, reward and punishment stuff, conditioned animal reflexes, coercive, and they'd require slave mentality, which is my second objection to the Pascal wager. It demands of us that we think of this God as a cynical, rather credulous, rather capricious opportunist, easily flattered, and of ourselves as the raw material for a pretty cruel and meaningless experiment. Now, often we unbelievers are accused of being nihilistic and not seeing the lovely, deeper meanings of life. Well, what could really be more negative, more pessimistic, more cynical than the attitude I've just described?
Let's go back to those people who are praying for you, because if you are in fact cured, then they'll take credit for it to some degree and perhaps even describe you as a miracle. Are you a bit nervous about that? Because, for example, we've had 2 cases of spontaneous remission from terminal cancer that allowed very recently the first Australian saint, Mary MacKillop, to become St Mary of the Cross. It only happened a month ago. But the idea of intercession by prayer has certainly not disappeared in the 21st century.
Well, no, it hasn't, and nor will it go away as long as our fear of death persists, which I rather think that it will. We're the only mammals, we're the only primates who do know that we're going to die. And we're the only ones who have made the attempt to reward ourselves under certain conditions in afterlife. It's a very tenacious illusion, and it's very unlikely to be dispelled. Sorry, this sometimes happens. How far back should I go?
I'm wondering, have you softened it all, and are you prepared to concede anything at all to the faithful, that there may be some value in it? I mean, the comfort that religious belief, for example, gives to people who are in the same position as you.
Tony, as with a lot of this argument, looking death more closely in the eye, as I have been doing, doesn't teach you much that you didn't already know, surprisingly enough. It focuses it a bit, brings it into quite a sharp relief. But it isn't as if I didn't already know that some people, whether they're sick or whether they're well, derive great comfort from the thought that they have a savior, that they're a member of a flock, for example. I mean, I personally am incapable of describing myself as a member of a flock for reasons that I hope are self-evident. I'm not a sheep. Some people like to be called sheep and think that they'd like to have a shepherd. If that makes them feel happy, I must say I think it's a rather contemptible form of happiness, but it doesn't bother me as long as they keep it to themselves. As long as they don't try and make me believe it, as long as they don't try and have it taught in schools, as long as they don't want the government to subsidize it, as long as they don't want to block scientific research in its name or because of it, then that's fine. As Thomas Jefferson said, I don't mind if my neighbor believes in one God or 15 gods. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg, as long as he or she leaves me alone. I don't want to even have to know what they think. But will they requite this bargain? Of course not. Of course not. It doesn't really make them happy. They can't be happy till everyone else believes it too. And that's sinister, in my opinion, and creepy.
You've grown to distrust the idea of a utopia.
Yes.
A world, I presume, actually, you would imagine a world without religion would be utopian. But let me ask you this: what do you think a world without religion, without all the cultural side effects of it, would actually look like? I mean, would it be verging on pure commercialism and materialism? I mean, would it take people away from any spiritual side of themselves at all?
Well, no, that wouldn't be it, because as we know from bitter experience, materialism and commercialism are unusually, inordinately compatible with religion. I mean, that's why there've had to be so many successive reformations, because the religious life goes so well with greed and accumulation and acquisition. When asked where they really want power and influence, this world or the next, they tend to think rather the same as the more crass materialists among us do. That doesn't make it any easier to imagine a world without religion. And it's not that I don't think I have too little imagination to imagine that. It's just that I think it cannot, in fact, be imagined. Religion is part of the human makeup. It's also part of our cultural and intellectual history. Religion was our first attempt at literature, the texts. Our first attempt at cosmology, making sense of where we are in the universe. Our first attempt at healthcare, believing in faith healing. Our first attempt at philosophy. All of them very crude, and all of them long since transcended and left behind. But respect for tradition alone makes it, I think, necessary for me to say that someone who doesn't know about religion or doesn't take an interest in it is only quasi-literate.
I would like to ask you what you think about Martin Amos's idea that writers like you must actually believe in some life after death, because not all of you, not all of the parts of you are going to die, because the printed words you leave behind constitute a form of immortality. You've obviously, I mean, is he just being kind, or do you think that there's a truth to that?
Litera scripta manet, the written word will remain. That's true. but it won't be that much comfort to me. I mean, of course I do write. I've always had the sense of writing, as it were, posthumously. I once wrote an introduction to a collection of my own essays. I stole the formulation from Nadine Gordimer. Said you should try and write as if for post-mortem publication, because only then can you screen out all those influences. Public opinion, some reviewer you might want to be impressing, some publisher you might want to publish you, someone you're afraid of offending, all these distractions. You write purely and honestly and clearly and for its own sake. And the best way of doing that is to imagine that you won't live to see it actually written. Then you can be sure that you're being objective and you're being scrupulous. I think that that's a wonderful reflection, but it doesn't, it isn't the same term as immortality at all.
As you say in your memoirs, you've written for decades, day in, day out. I think you said at least 1,000 words a day for many, many years, dispatches, articles, lectures, books, in particular books. Doesn't it give you some comfort that your thoughts and indeed some version of you is going to exist after your death is imperishable?
Well, if you want to know, because I try to avoid the blues when talking about all this, but if you want to know one of the most sour reflections that I have when I think that I'm 61 now and I might not make 65, I quite easily might not, one of the bitter aspects of that is, well, I put in 60 years at the coalface. I worked very hard. In the last few years, I've got a fair amount of recognition for it. In my opinion, actually, rather more than I deserve. Certainly more than I expected. And I could have looked forward to a few years of, shall we say, cruising speed, you know, just as it were, relishing that, enjoying it, not ceasing to work, not resting on laurels, but savoring it a bit. And that, I was just getting ready for that, as a matter of fact. And I was hit right at the top of my form, right in the middle of a successful book tour. I'm not going to get that, and that does upset me. So that's how I demarcated from immortality. Similarly, I'm not going to see my grandchildren, almost certainly not. One has children in the expectation of dying before them. In fact, you want to make damn sure you die before them, just as you'll plant a tree or build a house, hoping that it will outlive you. That's how the human species has done as well as it has. The great Cuban writer Jose Marti said that a man, he hadn't to say it was a man, 3 duties: to write a book, to plant a tree, and to have a son. I remember the year my first son was born was the year I published my first real full-length book. And I had a book party for it and for him, Alexander, my son, and I planted a tree, a weeping willow. I felt pretty good for the age of, what, I think 32 or something. But the thought of mortality, in other words, of being outlived, is fine when it's your children, your books, or your trees, but it doesn't reconcile you to an early death. No, it doesn't.
Is it only people outside of your existence then who can actually romanticize this idea of the immortal Hitchens?
Well, people write to me, and it does, I will say this, having, surrendered briefly to the blues there, that I don't want to put on any false front. I mean, in the same way, by the same token, there are people who write to me and say that what I've done or written has meant something to them, that I haven't wasted my time, that my life's been worth living. That's very nice too, but I'd like to have hung around and gotten more such letters.
It's interesting you should say that, because that's actually where I plan to end this part of our interview, because I do plan to give my sons letters to a young contrarian, and I really hope that they then pass it on to their children. And to me, whatever that means to you, that's kind of immortality, but it's something that that only people who've been following you for years can actually do.
Well, you couldn't have said a nicer thing, and I hope you would have said it. I'm sure you would, anyway. And I have to have, I'm afraid, the same response. I'd like to have heard even more people say that, and even met some of their grandchildren and seen if it worked for them too. And this I won't get, but I've lived longer than I used to think I probably would. I've written and published more than I thought I would. It's been better received than I expected, and without being falsely modest, in some cases better than I think I deserve. So don't mistake this for self-pity. But I'm not going to resort to any kind of bogus joviality either.
Christopher Hitchens, we'll leave you there for now. In the way of things, we're going to come back to you again tomorrow. We thank you for...
If I'm spared. Inshallah.
Today I'm called upon to honor a man whose name will be joined in the history of our movement with those of Bertrand Russell, Robert Ingersoll, Thomas Paine, David Hume. He's a writer and an orator with a matchless style, commanding a vocabulary and a range of literary and historical allusion far wider than anybody I know. And I live in Oxford. We don't just admire his intellect, we admire his pugnacity, his spirit, his refusal to countenance ignoble compromise, his forthrightness, his indomitable spirit, his brutal honesty. And in the very way he's looking his illness in the eye, he is embodying one part of the case against religion. Leave it to the religious to mewl and whimper at the feet of an imaginary deity in their fear of death. Leave it to them to spend their lives in denial of its reality. Hitch is looking it squarely in the eye, not denying it, not giving in to it, but facing up to it, squarely and honestly, and with a courage that inspires us all. Before his illness, it was as an erudite author and essayist, a sparkling, devastating speaker, that this valiant horseman led the charge against the follies and lies of religion. Since his illness, he's added another weapon to his armory, and ours, perhaps the most formidable and powerful weapon of all. His very character has become an outstanding and unmistakable symbol of the honesty and dignity of atheism, as well as of the worth and dignity of the human being when not debased by the infantile babblings of religion. Every day, he's demonstrating the falsehood of that most squalid of Christian lies, that there are no atheists in foxholes. Hitch is in a foxhole, and he's dealing with it with a courage, an honesty, and a dignity that any of us would be and should be proud to be able to muster. And in the process, he's showing himself to be even more deserving of our admiration, respect, and love. I was asked to honor Christopher Hitchens today. I need hardly say that he does me the far greater honor by accepting this award in my name. Ladies and gentlemen, comrades, I give you Christopher Hitchens.
Well, I'm overwhelmed, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, and I did promise Richard that if my voice didn't go to rags, I would try and speak to you a bit, if that's all right. After plead partly guilty of that myself, I thought I'd better come up with something before anyone else did. And it was supposed to be the four horsemen of the counter-apocalypse. But there it is, we got settled with it, and of course, long may this illusion flourish. It's promoted me to parity with Professors Dawkins and Dennis and Sam Harris. And I have set my whole life, I'd like to think, against the spread of delusion, rather wish this one a fair wind. It's rather nice to be associated in that company. It is true, however, that if we hadn't done it, someone was going to. It was going to have to be some kind of a pushback against what we could see coming. It was going to be a volunteer effort. It was going to communicate itself that way. How else were we going to reply to the increasing menace, rising menace of Islamic jihad? How are we going to, for example, deal with the emergence of probably the most reactionary papacy since the mid-19th century? How are we going, excuse me, I'm so sorry, I have to cough for a little bit. I was afraid this would happen, I do terribly apologize. A very reactionary Eastern Orthodox church, if it comes to that, as well, the Eastern Catholic forces. Thank you. Now arranged, many of them, behind the dark and sinister figure of Vladimir Putin. Then one mustn't exempt, of course, the millennial settlers in Palestine who believe that by bringing in as many fanatics of Jewish origin as they can and forcing out as many Palestinian Arabs as they can, they may bring on the Messiah and indeed the apocalypse, and look forward to the common destruction of our species with relish. And this, I think, lays a special responsibility upon us, particularly because the backers of these people tend to be in the United States. And though many of them don't like the Jewish people and have no love for all those who haven't accepted Jesus as their personal savior, they nonetheless are prepared to support extreme Jews, rather as the rope used to support the hanging man, make use of him while he brings on the Messiah. And then our reign of tribulation can begin too. What a wonderful bargain to be offering a democratic country. Richard is sometimes accused, you've heard it, of being overstrident. Before my voice went, I sometimes got accused of it too. It's a bit more reasonable in my case. I'm a sort of street-fighting polemicist from way back. I ask for it and I get it and I can dish it out. Richard is the defender of a great discipline, a wonderful discipline, biology, with revolutionary and transformative power in the way we think, in our attitudes to medicine, into our attitudes to our origins, and to finding out how beautiful and rare and wonderful, even miraculous, reality really is when we look it in the face. How should he not be strident to see his discipline being attacked and defamed, to see attempts being made to drive it out of the academy, to have the pseudo-scientific garbage taught now under the rubric of equal time. In the old days, the fundamentalists, if they could ban something, did ban it, as the Scopes trial proved. Losing that battle, they decided to go for equal time and the American way of fairness. Now they want it to be a sort of civil liberties and free speech issue. They've even got President Bush at one point to say, let's teach the debate. Well, by all means, let's teach the debate. But only in history class, or perhaps in civics. What we're not going to have is, well, boys and girls, I hope you enjoyed the chemistry period. Be ready for alchemy when you come back after the break. up with this we will not put. We're not going to have our children stultified and insulted by the teaching of garbage of this kind. And it seems to me an outrage that Richard has fewer friends in his profession. It's for them, I think, to rally and draw the sword and say, with our help too, that this nonsense will not pass. Now, some of you know, well, I guess you all know now, that the words of one of my favorite poets, Ernest Dowson, are quite often with me. Dowson stole them actually from the Roman poet Horace. Non sum qualis eram. I'm not as I was. And though, as I know as well as you do, there's no point in arguing about the actual date or time of departure, because I like to think there would be no good time. I hope you agree with that. There would always be something that I urgently felt I ought to do or say, and one mustn't repine or give in to self-pity about that. But at this present moment, I have to say, I feel very envious of someone who's young and active and starting out in this argument. Just think of the extraordinary things that are happening to us. Go, for example, to the Smithsonian Museum, to the new, I hope you've done it, to the new Hall of Human Origins. Magnificently curated new exhibition, which shows, among other things, the branch, or branches along which perhaps certainly three, maybe four if you count Indonesia, humanoid, shall we say, anthropoid species, died out not very long ago, within measurable distance of 75,000 years or so. Possibly destroyed by us, possibly not, we don't know. We know they decorated their graves. We think they probably had language ability. We don't know if they had souls. I'm sorry, I can't help you. We probably assumed that they were deluded into having some kind of God. But no religion is yet pronounced on these cousins and brothers and sisters of ours, because they don't fit. There's no way of fitting them into the ridiculous story that makes this tape wind round and round again and replay it and lead to us, to the grand solipsistic conclusion that this whole thing is designed with us in mind. But what a wonderful thing to be starting out in this tremendous new field of endeavor. How fabulous it would be if you had a gift for physics, to get a job as an intern with Lawrence Krauss, for example, who's just beginning to unravel, as very, very few people have yet dared to do, the idea of the alternate and parallel universe. And with each horizon that we reach, we see more bending beautifully towards and away from us. The knowledge we have, say, not just of the sentience, but also the cognition of animals, is all of it incredibly recent, a matter of decades, and enormously rich, and yet again, very much challenging our own claim to primacy or supremacy in the biosphere, and rich in every possible kind of discovery. I suppose I should begin to close now, because I've said all I wanted to say for myself, and I will join Richard if I may. You can ask me a question or two with your indulgence, but to say that I'm not going to quit until I absolutely have to, but that please. Because well, I wasn't finished. I'm not done. Till I absolutely have to. But I so envy those who could glimpse. I only mentioned 3 or 4 of the things that have magnetized and charmed and gratified me to think about in the recent past, and how much I hope that each of you forms some such ambition this evening and carries it forward. In the meantime, we have the same job we always had,
to say as thinking people and as humans that there are no final solutions. There is no absolute truth. There is no supreme leader. There is no totalitarian solution that says that if you will just give up your freedom of inquiry, if you will just give up, if you will simply abandon your critical faculties, a world of idiotic bliss can be yours. You will certainly lose the faculties, and you may not know as a result that the idiotic bliss is even more idiotic than it looks. But we have to begin by repudiating all such claims. Grand rabbis, chief ayatollahs, infallible popes, the peddlers of surrogate and mutant quasi-political religion and worship. The dear leader, the great leader, we have no need of any of this. And looking at them and their record and the pathos of their supporters, I realized that it is they who are the grand imposters. And my own imposture this evening was mild by comparison. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I'm defeated. I am absolutely convinced that the main source of hatred in the world is religion and organized religion. Absolutely convinced of it. Look anywhere you like for the warrant for slavery, for the subjection of women as chattel, for the burning and flogging of homosexuals, for ethnic cleansing, for anti-Semitism, for all of this, you look no further than a famous book that's on every pulpit in this city and in every synagogue and in every mosque. Do I, who've read Freud and know what the future of an illusion really is, and know that religious belief is ineradicable as long as we remain a stupid, poorly evolved mammalian species, think that some Canadian law is going to solve this problem? Please. No, our problem is this: our prefrontal lobes are too small, and our adrenaline glands are too big, and our thumb finger opposition isn't all that it might be. And we're afraid of the dark, and we're afraid to die, and we believe in the truths of holy books that are so stupid and so fabricated that a child can, and all children do, but as you can tell by their questions, actually see through them. And I think it should be religion treated with ridicule and hatred and contempt, and I claim that right.